Tim, how did you enter the orbit of Brendan Byrne?
Well, my first encounter with Brendan Byrne was actually after I had worked in his administration but had no contact with him and had left to run for the state legislature in 1977. And I was running in Somerset County, which you would recognize was the home county of Ray Bateman, his opponent. And so my campaign was running rather an independent streak relative to the Byrne election, and his fortunes had risen and fallen over the course of that race. But more importantly, I was running in a deeply Republican district in the place where the hometown senator had waited a long time to run for governor, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for his candidacy. So I was running rather as an independent Democrat. And somewhere in the heart of that county, I'm going to guess it might have been Boundbrook or somewhere along the Route 22 corridor, there was an afternoon candidates gathering that I attended. And Brendan Byrne arrived, and he arrived with his entourage, which was small by today's comparison, but you could notice that this was a gubernatorial candidate, not a humble legislative candidate. And I watched him perform. We didn't have, I think we might have exchanged greetings. I don't remember that. He performed adequately, briefly, and left. And his campaign style was never, at that stage, I think, his strength. I think he became a stronger and more comfortable public figure after his reelection. And that was it. I knew that my job was to, at that point, was to run as hard as I could and to look as independent of Brendan Byrne as I could. And got 49% of the vote in a deeply Republican district in a year when they were working very hard to elect the top of the ticket, who, outside of Somerset County, didn't fare so well.
Running for Senate or Assembly?
I was running for the Assembly.
What district?
Again, and it was the 16th district. In the Republican hierarchy of the moment, Ray Bateman had vacated the Senate seat, which was enabling Jack Ewing, who had been waiting a long time to run for the Senate, and it left an open seat in the Assembly. So not only among the two Assembly seats available, I had targeted one of them, not the one that Walter Cavanaugh was holding and was going to stay in, but rather the one that Elliott Smith, who was a newcomer and not all that well known in the county. And while I didn't target Elliott Smith per se, it was clear to me that if someone was going to win that race, it was only going to be one of two Assembly people, that Walter Cavanaugh was a shoo-in. And if there was a chance, it was that the newcomer might actually not have all the support that Walter did.
Did you have an Assembly running mate or a Senate running mate, or were you the lone Democrat?
I had both, and we still ran a fairly independent campaigns. We appeared together, but we didn't jointly fundraise, and we didn't jointly organize our efforts. And that's somewhat the nature of when you're running in a district that is as difficult as that. It's difficult to gain benefit one from the other, and I was clearly, in that instance at least, the stronger and better funded candidate.
What was your background that led you to be a candidate for office in the middle of Somerset County?
Well, the location is sort of an odd choice for a Democrat, but it was the coincidence of life. I'd grown up in Manhattan and spent summers and weekends in Bedminster on a farm that belonged to my parents. My father was a doctor, and his sister and brother-in-law had moved to that part of New Jersey in the early 20th century. My father was born in 1907, and he probably started visiting there in the early 20s, having moved up from Dallas, Texas. So if there's a reason why I ended up in that location as a Democrat, is that he was a yellow dog Democrat. His father had been the state party chairman of the state of Texas, a very close friend of William Jennings Bryan. My father's first name was William Jennings Bryan Carden, and he somehow had, in my view, the foresight to sit on William Jennings Bryan's lap at one point and said, I want to be named after my father. So he ended up George Alexander Carden. But after college, I had...
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Harvard, and I majored in government, so I had an interest in politics and in government. I probably spent more time in the theater than I did in government classrooms at college, and my brother, who was 2 years older and at Brandeis at the time, is still in the theater today, so we actually got to share space in the in the stage. But I came to New Jersey stayed at this farm, and in the fall of '72 worked in a congressional campaign that encompassed what was then the 5th Congressional District, running from Parsippany Troy Hills in northern Morris County down to Princeton in Mercer County. That was the breadth of that district. It was held by Peter Frelinghuysen at the time. And the Vietnam War and a sense of concern about the nature of where the country was going had stirred a lot of the progressive roots in that district, which were more still in the minority, but very active, and still are today. So Fred Bowen, who had worked in the Johnson administration and had been in the Ford Foundation, took a leave, and he was a Princeton resident, and ran for that seat. And we didn't do terrifically well, as you can remember. The McGovern-Nixon race made that a difficult race anywhere for Democrats, but particularly in a solid Republican district. But we thought, in retrospect, that the strength of both his candidacy, the sense of concern about the war, which this race really articulated, was a contributing factor to why Peter Frelinghuysen, 2 years later, chose not to run for re-election. He may have had lots of other reasons.
And who succeeded him?
Well, there was a primary in which Tom Kane was pitted against Millicent Fenwick, and Millicent Fenwick succeeded and became the candidate and eventually became the storied congresswoman from that district. But that was who we ran against in 1974, and I worked in that campaign as well.
For
Fred Bowen, again, 2 years later he chose to run a second time for that seat, and it was after he had declared his candidacy that Frelinghuysen announced that he was not going to run for re-election. We saw that as a great opportunity, and it was actually, for a district that was skewed probably as strongly as it is to a Republican bias, it had more attention and targeting from the national campaigns than it would have otherwise.
Was Fred Bowen related to Bill Bowen, the president of Princeton
No,
University?
he spells his name differently, Bohen. And Fred came very close in that race, a lot closer. Millicent won. But he went on to work with Joe Califano when Joe Califano was Health and Human Services Secretary. He was one of his senior deputies.
Under Jimmy Carter.
Under Jimmy Carter, and then moved on from there.
And what else were you doing besides working in campaigns at that time in your life?
That was the thing that I did the most. In between those two campaigns, I had traveled back to my native New York and worked for Herman Badillo when he ran in his first mayoral race, which I thought was a terrific campaign. I didn't have a particular affiliation with Herman Badillo. I had the experience of one long campaign under my belt, and I looked at the papers and knew that I was in New York, and I went to different campaign offices of candidates that I thought I would have an interest in and showed them my resume and said I had vast experience in political campaigning and wanted a job that paid money, which my first job hadn't. Was hired for $42.22 a week to do local issues research by Jack Bodie, whose brother Ken Bodie actually was. They were actually both very active in the original Iowa McGovern activities, and Ken went on to a career in journalism, and Jack stayed on in politics and then in nonprofit service.
You remember the number of cents in your paycheck?
Yeah, that one stuck in my mind because I actually got $50 a week to start with, and then they felt they had to withhold. So when it went from 50 to 42.22, it really stuck in my mind.
So you were really into the mechanics of electioneering.
I think I was causal in my approach. I really believed that it was a time to produce real change in the country and that there was opportunity to do that. And politics was the vehicle that I'd chosen to try and make that happen. And after the Badillo, which was Badillo against Beam, was a super primary runoff. There were 7 candidates in the New York primary, but Abe Beam, who eventually became the mayor, and Herman Badillo were the 2 finalists, and they had a primary runoff in '73. By the time that was over, Governor Byrne had just about won the primary here in New Jersey. And I did come out and visit his campaign offices and looked for work that was there, but they were flooded with people. If you looked at the polls, there was a good reason for them to be flooded with people. He was running very, very far ahead of Congressman then Sandman, who was a staunch supporter of Richard Nixon, whose fate was being decided at that time. So Brendan Byrne looked like a shoo-in. Not surprisingly, the campaign offices were flooded with lots of help, and while I gave thought to trying to work in that, I said, I really think they need less help than I can provide elsewhere, and I didn't go to work for Brendan Byrne then, and as a result ended up working for Fred Bowen in his second race in 1974.
Who sparked your interest in politics? Did anybody in your family, anybody at Harvard?
It's a good question. I think it's internally generated. There was no long history of political involvement by members of my family. As I recall, we did discuss the Nixon-Kennedy election, and I thought we were staunch Democrats. It turns out that my mother, to her dismay, had a change of heart on Election Day and ended up voting for Richard Nixon. I still don't know, in 1960. So there was conversation and deliberation about politics, but not a lot of activism in our family, and I'm the only member of our family that got involved in government or politics.
1974, you were involved in a second Bowen campaign, and in 1975, you joined state government. Is that correct?
That's correct. After the November elections in '74, I rewrote my resume and made it look more governmental than political, and traveled between Trenton and Washington, D.C., where I had at least acquaintances, if not friends, on both fronts, looking for a job in either the federal government or the state government. And the first one that suited me and that I was offered was in the Department of Transportation under then Commissioner Alan Sagner, whom I didn't know personally, but his executive assistant at the time was a man named Tim Hull, who had been working with Alan since the beginning of this administration, and who had been as a colleague Peter Shapiro. And Peter Shapiro had just left the administration to run for the Assembly himself, and leaving a vacancy in that office. Both of those were Essex County Democratic activists, as was Alan. So I was sort of an outsider to that circle and had known them tangentially, but Tim hired me and I went to work in the Department of Transportation.
You're now an Essex County resident, but you were at that time a Somerset County resident.
That's correct.
And so you took Peter Shapiro's position at Transportation, which was what?
Executive assistant to the commissioner. There were 2 or 3 sort of assistant jobs that were filled by generalists, not by specifically press or communications, that were sort of the go-to people to ensure that the initiatives of the commissioner were being followed up, or to take on special projects, on his behalf.
How was that experience?
I think it was alternately interesting, demanding, and frustrating. But most of all, I think it was as good an education into what makes a state, and I wouldn't say just state, but government the size of state government, what makes it work and what makes it awkward. Because the Department of Transportation is a well-established franchise. It knows what it's doing. Its mission hasn't changed. It was changed a lot it was in the process of changing while we were there. But public works is a central part of modern government, and obviously roads and their maintenance is a pretty central part of public works. So you have a bureaucracy that can and will deliver a product with reasonable certainty. It won't necessarily be the most efficient. It won't be as quick as some would like. It may make some hesitations along the way, but it's probably going to get the job done. And when you're in the process of trying to manage an agency of that size, there are 2 challenges. One is to not get in the way of the progress that's being made, and the other is, if you have ambitions to alter its mission or revise it, to recognize that it probably won't be as instantaneous as you'd like, because there's a process and a tradition and a history that you have to both address and overcome, in a sense, to make it work. And the time we were there, public transportation was just becoming part of its agenda. It's a much larger part of the department's agenda today, and the public transportation system, which was caught between public and private sector at that time, is managed almost exclusively within the public sector today. So within the department there was resistance to the idea that this new office, which started out as I think the Office of Public Transportation, it wasn't even a division or an operating entity, and which grew over the course of Governor Burns' 2 terms to become New Jersey Transit that we know today, a separate operating corporation, was trying to find its way along a path where people who were used to building bridges and roads and maintaining them wanted to secure both the attention and the capital and the resources that they could to that mission, and were not quite as enthusiastic about the idea of public transportation being a component of their agency, and equally resistant to the idea that environmental impact statements, which were really just coming again into their first stage of maturity, had a role in highway construction and maintenance. The best example of an environmental impact statement's growth during the term that preceded my arrival and certainly succeeded my departure, but spanned a lot of Brendan Burns' administration, is that the first environmental impact statement that was submitted to the Federal Highway Administration for Interstate 287 was a slim, single, probably 100-page volume. And the final was, I don't know the exact figure, a 13,000-page volume document. So the first effort at saying, we know how to build a road from all the way down here in Edison, New Jersey, all the way up to the New York State border, and we know what the environmental effects of that are, was probably 200 pages of, we're going to knock down a few houses, we're going to probably knock down a few trees, there might be a couple of streams we're crossing here, to what people today are used to seeing, which is awkward, cumbersome, but a necessary part of strategic planning.
When did Route 287 get built?
A lot of it was built by the time I got there. So, and some of it was certainly built before the environmental impact statements that are commonplace today were really being developed. So the part that was most in contention at the time I arrived was the segment north of Morristown up to the New York State border. And it had sort of, you had a department that said, well, we built all of this by basically saying we're going to knock down a few houses and we'll probably cross some streams and we'll let the Army Corps of Engineers know that. And if a few trees go along the way, that's part of the price of progress. To a department that was now looking at a whole host of new regulations and requirements that were being promulgated both by the federal government and by lawsuits and by the courts saying, no, you have to measure this in a whole host of different ways for the final, say, 30 miles, if that's what that distance is. And it was not completed during Brendan Burns' term. I think it was completed in the subsequent administration of Governor Kane, but not right away. It took a long time. It sat there, for those who study New Jersey politics, Congressman Bob Rowe, who became the chairman of the very important and powerful House Transportation and Public Works Committee, was a champion of this road, and I'm certain that his role in continuing to assure both its funding and the resolution of issues at the federal level, who have to approve the funding, so that they have to approve both the funding and the actual construction occurred.
What was Alan Sagner like as a boss
and
as a commissioner?
Alan Sagner was both both personable and an interesting boss. He had in some respects a developer's mentality, which means his attention span was very short, which is both an asset and a liability. But you wouldn't have a meeting that Alan Sagner sat through that would last longer than an hour. And there were a lot of people in that department who were ready to meet for a longer period of time than that. So things would end sometimes abruptly, but I think we probably got more done in the course of a day as a result of that. He was then, as he is today, very health conscious, and had converted the normal bowl of candy that sat outside of his office to one that only had raisins and peanuts. That was a symbol. He had used his own funds to install a shower in his office so that he could exercise in the middle of the day and still make certain that he stayed fit. And he embraced both the challenge of the department and its administration, but also the importance of this environmental movement that I think another commissioner who came strictly out of a background of public works could have been more resistant to. So that put him somewhat as a broker and somewhat at odds with elements of the department. At the time we were there, the economy was not in particularly strong shape, and there was an outcry within the government circles for more public works jobs, and that was championed, not surprisingly, by the champions of labor, and that put even greater pressure on why are we observing or holding up the construction of any number of different projects to complete these environmental statements. And the commissioner was both certain of his ground in saying we have to follow through this, and independent in the way that he expressed this sometimes. That independence didn't always comport with what the governor's office, I don't know about the governor, but the governor's office certainly wanted to hear coming out of their transportation commissioner, who I think they wanted to hear more resilient sounds of we're going to get more work out there, we're going to put more dollars to work quickly and get more people back to work. And it got to the point where Lou Carden dispatched John Degnan, then one of his assistant counsels, to DOT to sort of babysit Alan Sagner. He got an office that was in the commissioner's wing, and I think his principal job was to sit there and, before Alan went out and made another one of his statements about how we have to be measured in our response to this or that, that it would conform to what the governor wanted or what the governor's office and thought was appropriate. As John, I think, would tell you, it lasted about 3 weeks. It was the most frustrating position he held. He realized that Alan was a good and loyal soldier, not necessarily controllable, and that sitting there all the time wasn't probably going to exert a lot more effect or control. He may have also realized that the debate, whether it was always playing out in the governor's political favor, was an important debate to have. So he went back to the State House and the counsel's office to continue his job.
Did you view him when he arrived as a colleague and a friend, or as an interloper from another arm of government?
Yeah, I think of as the latter. It was that sense of tension that rises, and I think it's a very important part of both how New Jersey government works, but how agency and how the executive branch has many different moving parts. He was clearly an interloper or an observer, not there necessarily to support the principal for whom I work, but to support the agenda of the governor. And it's not as though we weren't all loyal to the governor, but the breadth of issues and problems that government confronts creates that difference. If you start with a view that every action of a government should be to enhance or strengthen both the image, popularity, re-electability of a governor, you won't get very far. You have to be prepared to take risks and assume that the results of those are going to inure to the public benefit, that the public benefit in turn will determine the day on any given election, and if not, that you still fulfilled what was your public responsibility. Given how tightly controlled I think some governors' offices since then have controlled the activities and statements of those agencies, this was a pretty light touch. One of the things that I credited Governor Byrne for much more when I worked directly for him, but realized to some extent during this period, was his commitment to and capacity to delegate and to trust people to do their jobs, not necessarily agree with them all the time, but that they were doing their jobs and they were doing them in large part in pursuit of the same interests that he thought were important, which were both policy initiatives on a broad sense, but also the public interest in a more direct sense.
I think it's an important point you make about a cabinet officer having to do what he or she thinks is right in his bailiwick without necessarily doing that which burnishes the reputation of the governor.
There's another important aspect to that, which is it also protects the government. If you delegate that responsibility, there's a degree of protection that is very hard to secure if you are exerting significant control over every moving part in your administration or in an administration, or trying to. So that if it is possible to allow someone to bring forth an initiative or an idea and to put it out there for either for action or for deliberation, and to neither bless nor condemn it, but to say that person is working that agency, which is their job, and I'm going to let them do their job if they're clearly going contrary to policies that I've set, broad initiatives that I've set, that's a different matter. But if it's the specifics of running the trains, or building the roads, or preserving the parks, or looking after those who can't look after themselves, that agency should have a chance to operate on its own. And within its purview, there are very interesting and qualified people who will actually execute that plan. If from the commissioner all the way down, people think that their actions are going to be subject to that sort of quick and immediate either political or news cycle review, it changes how effective you can be in doing things. And I think it limits what a governor or a chief executive can accomplish, because they're constantly being held accountable for things that 2 weeks later may be completely forgotten. So, or be great successes, but didn't look that way on the day that they began. So that delegation of responsibility, that willingness to trust people, not only to act on your behalf, but trust them to make mistakes and recover from them, is a very important part of this, which I didn't realize at the time. I do think that I learned it watching Brendan Byrne, and I think it's one of his great strengths as a chief executive of the state.
I'm not sure what you mean by this. You want to ask it?
Okay. Tim, you mentioned the distinction between what a governor wants or the governor's office wants. From your perspective in the department, which was later expanded when you moved over to the governor's office, but while you're in the department, how do you know who is speaking for whom in terms of the governor's interests, and when do you think you're getting manipulated by the staff instead of the governor himself?
You don't know, and you speculate a lot. And you don't know, and you speculate a lot from a departmental perspective. And one of the interesting insights that Bob Mulcahy brought to the governor's office when he became chief of staff, and one of the reasons he hired me to work for him, because when I went to work in the governor's office, I was actually hired by Bob Mulcahy, who had just been appointed chief of staff, was that we both had experience in state agencies in this administration and understood both that tension. We were both loyal to both the governor and to whom we were not in any sense disloyal, but we had a good understanding that those questions of who's actually asking this could paralyze reasonable routine activities that would occur at a state agency because you didn't get an answer to a particular question, or because you had gotten an indication that there might be a concern about action X, Y, or Z. So in an agency, and I think it may be truer in the first term than in the second term, I wasn't in the governor's office, obviously, in the first term, there is a significant risk that agencies will not be able to move as effectively or advocate, frankly, on behalf of their constituents as effectively, because they are busy trying to figure out whether what they're doing is within the realm of acceptability within the governor's perspective. To the question of what's the governor's position and the governor's office position, I think that's a very visible difference. The governor's perspective in this experience of mine is broad, and it's pretty clear when you are running the risk of crossing the governor's views or policies. The governor's interests, what's going to advance his or her well-being, is more the purview of the staff. And it is subtler, because no one's going to go out and announce a major initiative that's clearly going to benefit the public without either involving the governor if it's large enough, or informing the office that good news is coming. Similarly, if there's something of dramatic import that's negative, you're going to want to all hands on deck, and you're going to want to know that the governor's there. But there's a whole measure of activities that fall between those two broad, major good and major bad initiatives that you have to say, well, do we need to involve should we inform the governor's office of this? Not the governor. The governor won't want to know this, but maybe we should know the office. Once you do that, you're in a position of, do you act without a response, or do you await a response? And in the frequently frenetic activity of a governor's office, agencies wouldn't get answers for days on what could be very modest little initiatives. No one's trying to disable their capacity to deliver. It's simply the way things work. And you then either make the decision that you'll take the risk and go ahead and do it because nobody called you back, and then get the call that says, oh my God, why'd you do that without waiting to hear back from us? Or you spend a lot of time and effort trying to penetrate and get the answer one way or the other that you want to do.
Do you think you crossed the governor's office at transportation during those 2 years that you were there?
No, I think there were disagreements and disputes over how to answer certain questions, and there was a vulnerability that you could not avoid to not enough work, not enough public works going out, that was going to create a hue and cry. That hue and cry is going to be heard in the governor's office. You could have probably massaged it at different times to ameliorate it a little bit more, but the fundamental problem of not enough jobs going out was going to continue, particularly because the resistance to accepting the relevance of environmental impact statements was widespread in the construction and highway community. It was a relatively new phenomenon, and it was easy to say, why are we doing this? We need to, A, complete the project, and B, that will generate jobs, and this is all unnecessary paperwork.
There was a lot of ridicule back in those days of environmental impact statements.
Exactly. Tree huggers and sneaker people and all those phrases emerged because there was a legitimate public tension. And it continues to this day, but the environmental side of it, as we are all aware, has grown a lot more forceful and sophisticated and effective to the point where it's now, there are deserving questions asked on the other side as well, saying how much is how much? How much can you do this before you actually say we've now analyzed or studied or mitigated to our greatest extent?
Was there a road project or rail project that dominated your period of time there?
The 287. Well, from this dissension, two things happened while I was at the Department of Transportation. The first is we had a bond issue fail. So in either 1975 or 1976, and I think it was 1975, a public works bond issue, my recollection, it was $500 million, which would have at least provided money in a fairly strapped budget and in a down economy to support public works. Failed. It failed because perhaps it was an off year and people weren't particularly anxious to authorize the public to spend more money. I think that a legislative only elections year is a tough year to enact public bond issues, unlike presidential years or gubernatorial years where you get a higher turnout. It wasn't helped by the fact that the environmental movement imposed a lot of restrictions on the bond issue itself and ultimately was scattered in its support. It was not uniformly opposed because there were a lot of concessions placed in the bond issues to how money would be spent that would satisfy their interests on mass transit and on bikeways as opposed to just highways. But the support was scattered, and it created a lot of dialogue saying this isn't. It wasn't uniformly a voice out there saying this is a great thing, we have to support it. Whether that made a difference or whether it was simply the dynamics of the electoral climate, I can't tell. But once that failed, again, you had a very vocal and needy constituency, needy in the sense that the jobs were needed and the work was needed, with nowhere else to turn. This is a big engine when it's running at full force. So I don't recall specific projects that needed to be finished that were authorized for completion that were major, but both Interstate 78 and Interstate 287 were front and center in this environmental debate and continued to be, frankly, all the way through Governor Burns' administration. And because of their size and dimension and because they were interstate highways, they would frequently be at least the item that caught the most attention in the public eye. Why haven't you done this to move this one step closer to reality?
Today we could name the environmental leaders in Trenton. Was there an environmental leader you recall?
There were environmental groups. I don't think there was the level of day-to-day advocacy, lobbying, engagement that there is today. But not only in the environmental movement. I think I think that whole side of advocacy and information sharing has grown by many dimensions, and certainly in the environmental side it has as well.
Do you recall a particular labor leader being deeply involved in trying to get public works going?
Charlie Marciani hell-bent on getting public works going. He was developing a political opposition to Brendan Byrne because he probably didn't think that the governor was moving quickly enough or imposing his will on the Department of Transportation, whether you say it on Allen or on anyone else. Joe Hoffman, who was the Commissioner of Labor at the time, was very close to Charlie Marciani and ultimately ended up running for governor against Brendan Byrne at the end of his first term, in no small part because he thought he had Charlie Marciani and the AFL-CIO's backing.
Marciani was president of the AFL-CIO.
That's correct.
And as I recall it, or subsequently learned it, the dominant labor union official in the state of New Jersey?
Yes. Certainly, and very specifically in the area of public works.
And a Democrat, or unclear?
It's unclear. There are people, I didn't know, I met him, but I didn't know him personally, and there are people who would argue that he was a Republican his whole life, that he was others might have argued that he fought more for Democratic causes, but I think that's, I don't know the answer. I think it's interesting, however, that when Joe Hoffman finally did choose to run for governor and announced his candidacy, Charlie Marciani didn't support him.
Did not?
No.
Did he support Brendan Byrne?
I believe he supported Bob Rowe.
Uh-huh.
He did not support, I mean, Joe Hoffman had built this whole campaign on, if I have the support of the AFL-CIO, and he turned his back on the governor who had appointed him and said, I'm going to run against you, on the basis that he had the support of the AFL-CIO, and then Charlie probably said, I'm going somewhere else.
During the Byrne administration, the decision was made to complete Interstate 287, but not I-95. In retrospect, was that the right decision?
I don't feel qualified to judge whether it was a right decision or not. It was a decision made in the second term, and it was made under the leadership of Lou Gambaccini, who, of the transportation commissioners, whom I didn't work for because I was in the governor's office at the time. But of the transportation commissioners that I've seen in the state, had a better grasp of both the relevance of transportation in all its modalities, meaning both public transit and highway, and its importance to the functioning of the state. His grasp was as great as anyone I can know in that position. He certainly had vast experience in the field. He was a professional, not much less of a political appointment than many other cabinet officers, and certainly than Alan Sagner was. The question of de-designation of 95, which I supported at the time, was one that evolved not only around burgeoning issues of air quality and how much more traffic throughput can a state tolerate. It was an awareness of air quality issues was mounting, but also an allocation of funding. That it was clear that what had been a very generous interstate program with 90% federal funding and 10% state funding was becoming more and more constrained in its capacity to fund things without question or with certainty. So whereas in the 1950s and 60s, when that program was first launched, and going into the 70s, there was a certainty that if you got a project designated, it was going to have the funding it would need, and other needs would be met as well. Those constraints were being hemmed in. So it was not just a matter of de-designation of an interstate highway, it was also allocation of state and federal resources to critical transportation projects.
You used the phrase, the term de-designation. Explain the issue of de-designation of I-95 to those of us who weren't here at the time.
The interstate highway system, which began under the Eisenhower administration, was a public works project to create a network of highways across the country. And his methodology for, I believe, Eisenhower's rationale for suggesting that states could build highways with 90% of the money coming from the federal government was a belief that they should be built to a standard that would support defense movements within the country. So whether they were designed to take the largest tank or not, they could take as big a truck or as big a vehicle as the Defense Department could ever need to move goods and troops around the country. Whether they envisioned that as critical or as a way of actually creating a network of highways across the country is something that I don't know the answer to. So Each state had an obligation to prepare a plan of interstate highways for within its borders. And they had to, and the rules were that they had to connect one to the other. So an interstate highway can't just end on a state road. It has to end either at the water's edge or at another interstate highway. So it would be an interlocking system. Once the initial plans had been drawn up, they were amendable. You could change your plan once you've done it. I don't know the process for amendment, but I can imagine it was difficult, complicated, and time-consuming. And in order to take a highway and remove it from the interstate system, you would have to de-designate it. That was the term. That the federal government would have to both accept the logic and the purpose and be certain that the overall transportation objectives of the interstate system were still being met.
So where did 95 begin and end in New Jersey?
At the time this whole program was launched, the New Jersey Turnpike had already been built. So I-95, so the New Jersey Turnpike and the interstate system at that time did not include any toll roads. That was not part of the plan. But the Turnpike accommodated the dimensions and purpose of the interstate system. So it was designated I-95 from exit 10, where Interstate 287 joins it, up to the George Washington Bridge. South of 10, there was no I-95, which came up through Pennsylvania and crossed just north of Trenton. So the Interstate 95 in Pennsylvania comes up and crosses north of Trenton onto what's now called 295. And the 95 that was de-designated was supposed to pick up on that beltway from around Trenton and carry up to the exit 10 area of 287. So it would intersect with 287. And then the existing turnpike would continue. And that's what we have today, with the exception that the designation of I-95 was moved down to I believe exit 7A on the turnpike, to where it connects with Interstate 195. Or else I'm wrong about that, and there's still a missing link that could someday be resurrected and built.
I-92.
Yeah. Well, one interesting piece of the interstate struggles in this state is that there was plans to build an interstate highway straight through Newark and Jersey City that I think was called, I don't remember the number, but its designation that created I-195, which is, and it happened at a time when another congressman, Jim Howard, was whose district who represented that district, was a ranking member of the House Transportation and Public Works Committee. So it was a way of moving available federal funds from one area of the state to a project that wasn't going to succeed to another area of the state.
And it's the James J. Highway,
I
think.
On his death, he was named after him.
Who else did you work with at DOT besides Alan Saginaw?
Well, there was a deputy commissioner, Manny Carballo, who came out of the Lindsay administration and was a really competent and sophisticated government manager. And he went on, I think, to administration in Massachusetts subsequently. I worked with Peter Stengel, who was one of the first heads of the Office of Public Transportation. He went on to be chairman of the MTA in New York. But he worked in that administration for probably the 2 years I was there in DOT, and for another 4 years after that. And in the second term, once I left the department and had my run for government, I worked with a number of officials who came into that department and to the beginning of the New Jersey Transit operation.
From your perspective, what were the problems during the first administration between DOT and the governor's office? What were the problems, or who were the problems? Who did you meet resistance from? Who did you have difficulty understanding or getting through to, if anyone?
I was a step down the pecking order, so I didn't have daily interactions with the governor's office. I had internal operations as sort of an area that I work with, so it was not as though I knocked heads with the department on a daily basis. Tim Hull had the legislative relations role, and I think Alan really managed the both governor's office and treasury deliberations that happened between DOT and
what were the reputations within DOT of people like Dick Leone and Lou Carden?
They were, I think they were appreciated by Alan, who had been, the finance chairman for Brendan Byrne as a candidate, and certainly felt that he had a role in portfolio, while different from theirs, that was equal. So two individuals who were reputed, and probably correctly reputed, to be very smart and capable and driven and not necessarily the most accommodating to others. I don't think Alan had difficulty in relating to either of them. He was successful before he came into state government. He had recently sort of made a decision in the course of the campaign to try his hand at something other than what he had done professionally, and the opportunity to work within a government administration is something that he not only aspired to, but I think took to very well as well. He has a strong bent for public policy, which I think both Dick and Lou would have respected. But at the same time, there was an enormous challenge in the school funding issues and in the economy, which probably affected DOT more, all of which consumed the governor's office time. And there were not that many occasions where DOT could constructively contribute to solving one of those problems. So you had needs of your own, you had contributions you could make, whether it was a ribbon cutting or announcement of something positive. But those were few and far between, so that the debate would be over getting answers to issues that seemed relevant enough to bring to the office's attention, and to some extent negotiating the whose job is it to make what announcement, and what should the phraseology be that of the public face of DOT in the face of a challenging economic environment.
Was Brendan Byrne popular when you arrived in state government?
He may have been popular at the time I arrived, but there had already been one failed effort at the income tax, and by that summer, which was the summer of '75, so the legislative elections that lost a number of seats, he was not enormously popular or in demand, and his political persona was not as respected as I think his understanding of government was. That he was probably underestimated in terms of his political calculation at the time, because he had a kind of an awkward public presentation. It wasn't always at ease, and he wouldn't always, the sense of humor that has emerged so much since wasn't as evident then. And these were difficult times. We had taken on a major challenge. We had schools in a very difficult spot, and no answers financially to solve that problem, but a certainty that this was a team that was going to try and make it happen.
He would come to be known as One-Term Byrne. As this phenomenon was happening, this sense that an incumbent governor was about to get tossed out on his ear, did that have any impact on morale over at DOT?
It didn't affect the line bureaucrats. It clearly affected those of us in the unclassified or politically appointed positions, those positions that were close to the administration. The one-term Byrne syndrome really evolved from the successful vote for the income tax. And what's to me interesting about that is that, having proposed in two different ways income taxes before, he had placed the issue in the hands of the legislature and said, we need a resolution, and we need it by the fall. He had the benefit of a Chief Justice who had served in the same office that he was currently occupying, whom he might have had some relationship with, who chose to close the schools, but chose to close them during the summer months, so that you had a confluence of both informed and good strategists. I think the strategy of the Chief Justice to say, we aren't going to open the schools until you solve this funding problem, but do it during the summer so that you don't have absolute student chaos. And a governor who says, I've given you 2 proposals that you've rejected as answers to this funding problem. Now, instead of saying, and I'm going to browbeat you into a 3rd one that you may not accept, said, so you come up with your own answer and let the problem deliberate with this deadline hanging over them, were critical to success.
What did it feel like being in government that summer of '76?
Well, it felt very... there is a part of the daily work. I wrote memoranda of record of almost every meeting that the commissioner had, so that we would have not only a document that described what happened in that meeting, but an agenda of action that was supposed to come out of it. So whether it was with external folks who were seeking road or other projects and visiting with the commissioner, or whether it was internal staff learning what the assignments and priorities were, I sort of had the pen and I had the record. It could be that part of it was a very demanding but routine job. On the other hand, I found government a very heady place to be, in that I felt then, even in small ways, that I was participating in trying to improve and advance the lot of the state and of its citizens. And the commitment to that was pretty universal. So you could debate and deliberate and be frustrated with the response you did or didn't get from one or another agency, but there was a real sense that there was a purpose being served here that was larger than the debate and than the individuals.
As it became almost certain that Brendan Byrne couldn't be re-elected, did you consider leaving state government?
Well, as a matter of fact, I did leave state government.
Did or did not?
I did leave state government to run for office myself. But I think that was prompted less by Brendan Byrne's diminished chances, since I'd be running in the same party he was, and simply by a sense that there was an opportunity for me to run for public office in a district that I had pretty close familiarity with, because I'd worked in it in 2 successive election cycles and had a number of friends and political supporters within it.
So you left when to run for what?
I left in early 1977 to run for the state legislature.
In District 16 again?
In the 16th district, which is the home district of Ray Bateman, who at that time was not certain to be the nominee, because once again he was in a contest with Tom Kean, who he beat in the Republican primary.
And you had come so close 2 years?
No, this was my first run for office. Yeah, but I had hopes that Tom Kean, for selfish reasons, would win the primary, because it would have diminished the activity and support that the Somerset County organization would have invested in a general election.
So when did you leave government?
I'm going to say December of 1976 or January of 1977.
So you must have been dashed when Bateman won a primary over Kean.
It was not helpful. It was not helpful.
And did you have running? Oh, yes, we've been there.
Yeah.
You had running mates.
Yeah.
For the. Who was your Senate running mate? Do you recall?
I'm trying to remember. I believe that Tim Cunha was the other legislative candidate, and I don't remember the name of the Senate candidate.
But you say you ran a fairly independent campaign.
It was a very independent campaign, and it was the only way to really try and pick off one seat. Was your experience in the Byrne administration a drag on your candidacy? No, it gave me a foundation for saying I had credibility and reason to be an effective legislator, because I understood the executive branch, and I even used my close relations within the Byrne administration to orchestrate events that would advance my candidacy.
Such as?
Well, for example, we had a classic transportation issue, an issue of high-level lighting in Bridgewater at the intersection of 22 and 287, which is a form of lighting that's different than the traditional highway lamp poles. It's say 3 times the height and 5 times the intensity, so it basically washes the whole area in light. So if you have a complicated intersection, transportation theory is everybody gets to see where everybody is and you don't run off the road.
That was the Somerville Circle, right?
This was just north of the Somerville Circle. Well, the communities it was in Bridgewater, and there was an extremely active, informed, intelligent group of largely, but not exclusively, women who had analyzed this issue and believed that it was detrimental to their community and to themselves and to the surrounding homes.
Light pollution?
Light pollution. And they did a lot of research on this and came up with analysis of what it would do to wildlife and what it might do to a whole host of other things, and demanded a meeting with the governor or the governor's office. And I got Don Linke to host a meeting at which he could be browbeaten by this crowd of really intelligent and well-informed women who knew a lot more about the issue than I did and who wanted a place to be heard. And so there was an example of my experience in the Byrne administration inuring to my benefit as a candidate.
Did the lights get built?
I think they did ultimately, but not quickly.
This is Don Linke. I'll chip in a little bit because I remember that meeting well. I think there were maybe 500-600 people there.
Really?
It was unbelievable.
And they
Not in your office?
No,
No,
it was a public meeting.
It was in the chamber somewhere.
Yeah.
But in any event, I was amazed. First of all, they sent me up. I thought it'd be, 10, 20 people. And also, I was so impressed by the intelligence of the audience. There were PhDs in botany and engineers who had so much more knowledge than the state people in the Department of Transportation that I think we essentially said, you know more than we do, and we'll go back and rethink what we're doing.
I think that's exactly right, because it didn't get built during that election cycle. That much I'm certain of. And my recollection, having driven it in the last 20 or 25 years, is that there's some high-level lighting there now. But hopefully those impacts have been mitigated and addressed, and we're growing the right plants and saving others as a result.
So while Brendan Byrne was confounding conventional wisdom, you were focused on your own campaign, but what happened? How did Brendan Byrne confound conventional wisdom that year?
Very simply, and to his credit, he stuck to his guns. He didn't back down. He, I believe, informed the public that he hadn't entertained or engaged with, that he was predictable in what he was doing and steadfast, so that they knew what they had on that side. With the help of former Secretary of Treasury William Simon, Ray Bateman came out with a plan for funding schools that made no sense. And it was apparent the minute it came out that it made no sense. So the opposition, in a sense, from a substantive standpoint, which seems so alien to a lot of what we see of politics today, looked like an emperor without clothes. While people could easily criticize the idea that the state had enacted an income tax and that Brendan Byrne had supported it, it's an easy cause to rally around as an opponent. There wasn't an answer to school funding, which people at that time acknowledged was something that both because the courts demanded it and because they raised the idea needed to be done.
You think it's unusual that a substantive position sinks a candidacy?
In this instance, it was so much a cause of the expectation was that the issue was going to drag Brendan Byrne down. The absence of a coherent response, which, flim-flam and one sentence sound bites appear to be successful in so many instances, weren't going to work here. People saw through it. And perhaps most important, from a straight political standpoint, the Bergen County Republicans and Independents who commuted on a daily basis to New York, many of them, and paid income tax to the city of New York, realized that they weren't going to pay a New Jersey income tax, and that if this had some modest impact on reducing or slowing down the growth in their property tax, it was a good thing for them. So, contrary to all those expectations in polls, the Bergen County results were very favorable to Governor Byrne, and Bergen County was a far less Democratic county at the time than it is today. So that was just one good example of what I think people saw through the rhetoric, they looked at the facts, and they made a determination that made sense.
Do you recall the nickname for the Bateman fiscal plan?
I'm trying to remember what it was the BS plan?
Bateman Simon.
The BS plan. I do remember being a supporter of the income tax in a district that wasn't anxious to hear about support of the income tax, and having a good lesson in political advance or in preparation, because I think it was in Chester. I had a couple of communities in Morris County were included in the district, and someone asked me, how high I thought the income tax could go. And I think I used 11% as a figure, which I'd gotten from somewhere. And I realized as I walked out of the room that however many people in that room and however many relatives they had in the district, I had just lost all of them.
What
wasn't
was,
reported
what was
in
the high
paper.
rate? 3%?
3, yeah. But they said, how high would you let it go? And I don't know. I'd read an analysis somewhere, and I was young and naive.
And honest.
And honest. I said, well, it could go up to as high as 11%.
What else do you remember about your campaign season? Meetings, confrontations, senses of victory. What do you?
There were great moments of excitement and enthusiasm. It was a campaign that generated a lot of interest. So I had young people and people whom I had met in 2 preceding election cycles that climbed on and did more for me than I could possibly admit. So there was.
What was your issue?
The biggest issue that I found success with, I was generally probably aligned with and supportive of most of the things that Brenton and Byrne said, although if the income tax was the dominant issue, I was supportive of the income tax. I said that land use planning in this area was the most important step that these communities had to take as a whole, because with at that point, 78, which runs right through the heart of that district, was not complete. I came from the township of Bedminster, which had endured and was in the process of enduring a 10-year suit over affordable housing adjacent to an AT&T Long Lines facility that employed people who probably were commuting between 15 and 30 miles a day simply because they couldn't afford to live in the township in which their corporate headquarters was located. And I looked at the whole corridor along Route 78, and my argument to them was, you want to preserve the quality of life that you have. And you think that as individual municipalities, you can withstand the pressures of economic development and growth that will occur when this highway is completed, and someday it will be. And you're wrong. You will succumb one by one, and you will find yourselves with a whole set of both environmental and quality of life issues surrounding where commercial development ended up, where residential development ended up.
Were you right?
Absolutely.
But that area is not, other than the hills, which got built after...
Well, I had another agenda. This was my way of saying that we can't abandon our cities, which I didn't think was as coherent an argument for Somerset County.
But the Route 78 corridor is not that bad today. I mean, it developed okay, one would say.
Drive it. No, it is. It's interesting because the Route 78 corridor, once it was completed, looks and appears very comfortable relative to the Route 80 corridor, which if you ever get in your car during rush hour, listen to the traffic reports, you'll always hear something on Route 80. I've heard it for 10 years. Right now, 78 is probably at or above capacity, and what we have not succeeded in doing is saying, here's a coherent way to utilize the resources that we can't replace, which is our land and our open space. And simultaneously, we have yet to create a coherent and effective framework for investment in our cities that says these are sites where we will, as a state and society, make the investments that are necessary to make the site competitive and economically viable for new businesses.
You were trying to become the assemblyman from the Bedminster area. You say affordable housing was something of concern to you. What do you think about the Hills development, which brought thousands and thousands of units of new housing, 20% of them set aside for lower and middle income people or lower and moderate income people? What do you think about a development like that?
That development was the outgrowth of the suit I mentioned earlier, which was in the courts when I was running in 1977. And
nothing had been built yet.
Nothing had been built yet. And part of the argument that I made from no more than a fairness standpoint, I said, everyone who lives in Bedminster has just realized a 50%, if not more, reduction in your property tax. That's what the AT&T Long Lines, the effect of the AT&T Long Lines was, literally a 50%. I said,
when AT&T moved in,
when they moved there, everybody's property tax, they said to finish the building, property taxes dropped by 50%. And here you were 8 or 10 years later. And to me, the argument that the people who worked there who are generating all this revenue that's that's enabling us to live the way we do there without an increase in property tax, and can't live there. There ought to be some opportunity to do that. So I think that the Hills, and I campaigned there more recently when I ran for Congress in 2002, and I think it's a pretty successful development. It has a mixed demographic group. There's some very high-end housing in some sections, and definitely affordable housing units in others. And given the growth of jobs for which people who need affordable housing could qualify for in that area, that housing is needed. And there probably isn't enough of it overall in that general area. So it's an important step.
You said you got 49% of the vote in that election. After you got over losing, how long did that take, by the way?
A long time. It takes a while, yeah, it takes a while. But I sort of pulled myself. I actually got to meet and had the benefit of campaigning with Bob Mulcahy, whom I hadn't known in the first administration, but he'd been the mayor of Mendham Borough, which was in the district. So he campaigned with me on the streets of Mendham. I almost won Mendham, and I certainly didn't almost win Bedminster, which was my hometown. And I sort of pulled myself up by my bootstraps and said, I got to move on with life. And at about the same time, Bob was then the Commissioner of Corrections, but had been announced in transition that he was going to be the Chief of Staff to the Governor, and he called me shortly thereafter to ask if I was interested in coming back into the administration. So I had a short period of mourning, and then an opportunity presented itself fairly quickly.
What did you think you might do before Mulcahy called?
I was contemplating whether to simply find a way to earn a living and run for the Assembly again in that area. I thought there was a good chance that in the right year we could actually win that district. And if I didn't do that, I was looking at opportunities in going back into government.
So when Mulcahy called, what did he say?
Well, Bob and I had developed a good relationship during that campaign. I think we had met. We'd actually met in the previous campaign for the congressional candidate Fred Bowen that I'd worked for in 1974, and included that, but not spent much time together. And I was enthusiastic about the conversation we had about his approach to the governor's office and the importance of having people who had experience in the state agencies, which was a common bond that we shared. And so I was persuaded quickly that this was an opportunity that was as interesting as I might have had in the legislature, if not quite as independent, and one worth pursuing.
Did he give you a specific position he wanted you to fill?
He wanted an executive assistant, which was my first title there, and it was clear to both of us that my strengths were not in dealing with the legislature or with other parts of the executive branch, but in helping him create a more coordinated and effective relationship between the governor's office and the agencies. And it was shortly after I got there that we recreated or renewed the position of cabinet secretary, which had existed briefly in the first term, but was they left the position vacant after the first incumbent started doing four-way searches on people who might or might not be candidates without asking anyone else for the authority to do so. It was sort of like the guy's name was Jeff Ketterson. And again, this is all I learned once I got the job, not while I was working for Alan Sagner. He took it upon himself to sort of be the investigator of record for existing potential other candidates, and so he was sending out authorizations for people to have state police checks done on their background without any certainty that this person either should be subject to that or was even eligible for a position that they might someday get. So that was one of a number of concerns that his presence in the governor's office made, and when he did leave, which he did, they just didn't fill the position.
Let's take a break.
Okay. Yeah. No, I came
before the second term.
No, I came in like in
January.
Yeah.
So Bob Mulcahy offered you a job. You took it promptly. You don't recall
Yep.
whether you took it on the spot or needed a day or two to think about it.
I don't remember.
Okay. And you came in as an executive assistant to the chief of staff.
That's it. Yep.
Was he the first chief of staff? Had there?
In the second term.
Okay.
There was a chief of staff, I think, it was executive secretary up until then. So yes, you're right. It
He
was the first chief.
He kind of created that
That's right.
position. And Harold Hodes would succeed him,
And Harold came in as the deputy
chief
of staff.
Who did you report to?
Bob.
And what was your title? Executive assistant?
It was executive assistant, and then when I was promoted to cabinet secretary, while I conferred with Bob, I was technically a report to the governor.
How long after you started did that happen?
Bob lasted until the Sports Authority opened. And then there was a question as to whether Bob was going to stay as chief of staff or take a position as the first head of the Sports Authority. And he chose the Sports Authority. Which
was that about a year later?
Yeah, it's about a year.
What did you do that first year?
Just as we were talking before, I spent a lot of time developing relationships with each of the cabinet officers and their senior staffs. And developing relationships meant enabling them to do their jobs better. That was a large part of it. Now they had from a legislative standpoint, they had direct contacts and specific personnel assigned in the counsel's office who looked at all legislation. But on administrative matters, it wasn't as clear, and we assumed in Bob's office and in that side of the governor's office the responsibility for either initiating, overseeing, or facilitating administrative actions, the opening and closing of something, the announcement of one initiative or another. Or in conjunction with that, when we had cabinet meetings or meetings with cabinet officers and the governor, there would always be an agenda that came out of that meeting, generally the governor's agenda. And the governor's agenda wasn't always the first thing on that person's list when they left the office, so one of my responsibilities was to ensure that it stayed high on their list and that it got completed.
Well, now you're on the other side of the equation from the one we were talking about a little while ago. It must look different from the perspective of the governor's office.
On the one hand, it looks different. On the other hand, we approach that not as dictators, but as people who have to work together to achieve common objectives. And so going back to tell the governor that something that he had mentioned to his cabinet officer he really wanted done, and it's not done a month later, doesn't help anyone. So even if it wasn't the first thing on someone's list, it was always useful to say, let's make certain that this gets done so that the other things you're trying to accomplish are.
Was Aron Sagner still Transportation Commissioner?
No, Lou Gambaccini had taken over that position in the second term and was a very active and engaged commissioner from the day he arrived, and the agenda was one of the largest that in terms of actual activity and even in terms of initiative that this administration undertook, because it was during that administration that we not only succeeded in passing a major bond issue which reinfused capital funding for transportation, but we also established the New Jersey Transit Corporation, got the legislation enacted, and appointed the first board, first director, and actually sorted out the bulk of public transportation activities from the department and placed it in this new corporation. Included in that was the acquisition of a whole host of railroad assets that emerged from the Pennsylvania Railroad bankruptcy and from Conrail's decision to get out of the passenger rail business. When Pennsylvania Railroad went bankrupt and there was a recognition that there was a need both to maintain freight service, but more importantly from a state government standpoint to maintain commuter service, Conrail was the entity that took over the assets of the bankrupt Pennsylvania Railroad, and they also operated the passenger service that was being operated over those tracks. But they got out of that business, and states acquired major pieces of rail right-of-way and rail assets.
What, if anything, do you know about why Mulcahy created this new title, Chief of Staff? What was the rationale or the idea there? Do you know?
I think that Bob's approach reflected both a background in business and a sense of organizing around the functions, the operational functions of government, which he had been deeply involved in during the first term. When he came to state government, he joined. He was the deputy commissioner for Commissioner Ann Klein.
What had he done before?
Who oversaw both institutions and agencies. And it was a sprawling, massive bureaucracy, and is still today, even in its somewhat divided state, meaning that pieces of it have been carved out since, it's still the largest department in terms of actual spending. At that point, it would have dwarfed the other departments because it ran and operated all the prisons, the schools, and facilities for the developmentally disabled, all the hospitals that house the mentally ill in the state, and ran the troubled and at-risk youth programs under DIFAS. Plus, they had a number of other agencies. Plus, they had community service branches of those different divisions. So it was, at the time that I became commissioner 3 years later, it had a $2 billion budget out of a $6 billion state budget. And today, I think the budget of the current Department of Human Services is on the range of $7 to $8 billion in a $36 million budget. So.
What was his background? Did you say business? He came out of business.
He'd run a business in the Morris County area. I think it was in development and construction.
You think that his predecessor in that position called himself executive secretary and not chief of staff?
Yes, there was a tradition to that executive secretary to the governor, and it's I think Bob's goal and role was different than just being sort of an overseer of the activities of the governor's office, and wanting to create a capacity to bring some management capacity, some management capability to the governor's office that was not competitive with, but separate with counsel's role, which had a different relationship with each of the agencies.
What departments, what commissioners did you most interface with during that first year?
During the, I can't remember whether it was different in the subsequent years, but Human Services, Transportation, DEP to a lesser extent, corrections when things came up, because that was sort of it was less frequent, and then Energy, which was had a sort of a roller coaster presence in the administration, meaning that there were times when the energy issues would rise to the surface, and when they didn't, it was a fairly quiet agency, and occasionally community affairs. Those are the ones. I dealt with the Attorney General, but there were fewer action initiatives, and because John Degnan had been in that office, he had a very direct relationship with the governor, and they discussed and dealt with court and legal issues outside my purview. If there were administrative issues, I dealt with them.
Give us a description of each of the commissioners in those departments that you just rattled off.
Lou Gambaccini was a very effective and thorough and thoughtful public manager. He understood government. He was a true believer in the importance of government and its role in society, and he brought those skills of 25 years of running services at the Port Authority, most notably the PATH service, to the Department of Transportation. He brought expertise that the public hadn't, and in particular the legislature hadn't necessarily seen in every commissioner, and so he brought credibility to the debate.
Was he a New Yorker coming over to New Jersey,
no,
or was he returning to New Jersey?
He lived in Ridgewood and raised his family in Ridgewood. When he took the job in Trenton, he actually moved there during the week because he was working long hours. But he'd always been a New Jersey commuter to the Port Authority in here. Ann Klein, who was continued from the first term, was a recognized and revered advocate for people with needs of different sorts. And
she was it called Human Services?
It was then called the Commissioner of Human Services. And she was very effective in both advocating and articulating the issues, but not as strong a manager, and it was a sprawling bureaucracy. She had good people underneath her, and we probably had a number of issues that percolated up to the governor's office because they were either important or she wanted the governor to know what was going on to get the attention and support that she needed. She was a terrific.
How had she become commissioner? What
she ran against Brendan Byrne. She was an assemblywoman from Morris, or West Essex County. Morris County, which was unheard of, and Democrats didn't win in Morris County. They still don't win that often. And had, as a liberal Democrat, and had run against Governor Byrne in the primary in 1973. So he knew her and invited her after the primary, after the general election, to join his administration in that capacity. So she had a very strong relationship with the governor. Commissioner of Corrections, Bill Fauver, had basically grown up in the correction system, and with a particular of New Jersey, with a particular prerequisite of having served as the warden of Trenton State Prison, which is the most significant maximum security prison in the state, and had been a deputy under Bob Mulcahy. So he was seasoned, experienced, and reliable in managing what no one else really wanted to know too much about, which is how we run our penal system. And issues came up on funding occasionally and on incidents. Who would deal with that? Jerry English was became the commissioner of DEP. There was, I think, Rocco Ricky was the commissioner at the start of the second term. I had familiarity with transportation, so it came to me naturally. I had an engagement and interest in the human service field, so my grasp of that came faster, and I was able to facilitate things. The DEP debate within the governor's office was, to some extent, on budget, because there was always parks and forests and the amount of resources we had to devote to that. But on the regulatory developer side, it was more, there were fewer policy initiatives. Obviously, the Pinelands, when it came up, is an enormous part of that, but it wasn't directly an agency issue. So I had less direct involvement with DEP. And Rocco Ricky was a professional, competent, very good, and when Jerry took over, it was as a skilled administrator who knew the...
She came out of the governor's office.
And she came out of the governor's office and moved over there. So she had the governor's ear. It was not an issue as to... She also was, in that movement, there was an assumption that she would understand the governor's priorities, and if there was an issue that reflected the two, they'd sort that out.
Community Affairs?
Joe LaFonte was the commissioner of Community Affairs, and an ardent Byrne loyalist who had stood up for him when the income tax vote was called for, and he was a Hudson County politician who had also run a furniture store, and was very much in touch with the communities, and a very willing ear when the governor had something that he wanted done.
Oh yeah, you did say energy, so let's resume there. Commissioner of Energy.
Joel was
Joel Jacobson.
Joel Jacobson was the commissioner. He was the first commissioner of energy, which had been created as a department in part because of the oil crisis in the mid-70s, and he was again a really loyal and ardent advocate for both the causes of energy conservation, which he embraced immediately, for the causes of labor, which he came to naturally. I always remember that he said he would never on the Garden State Parkway go to a booth that had a token basket, because he wanted to make certain that he handed his change directly to an employee who was getting paid to pick up that employee. So I don't think he'd have been a big fan of Easy Pass, and who was extremely loyal to the governor.
Cliff Goldman.
I had a lot of interaction with Treasury, and Cliff was a really quiet and strong presence who largely kept his own counsel, always knew where all of the money in the administration was and how to effectuate change when it was possible. And on a number of occasions, I was responsible for brokering different resolution of funding issues with agency heads and Cliff. There's one in particular that I often recount as how government can be important but appear, the workings of government can appear trivial but be important, and it involved the Department of Corrections and the Department of Human Services. The Department of Human Services had contracted with and this issue arose to the governor's office, and I was sent to have a meeting with the treasurer, myself, the commissioner of corrections, and the commissioner of human services. And the commissioner of corrections had actually been in Ann Klein's in department when corrections was part of it, so they knew each other well. They certainly got along, but they were having a dispute that they couldn't resolve. Corrections had been contracted by the Department of Human Services to wash sheets from institutions. And there's quite a volume of sheets that come in, and recently the department had made a major expenditure for new washing machines. This was the Department of Corrections. So they had a big budget item and an investment in new washing machines. These were all operated by prisoners, and by the description of the Commissioner of Human Services, and with some affirmation from the Commissioner of Corrections, it was noted that they would, in their zeal or anger, push the sheets into the washing machine so tightly that there was no room for water, so that there was very little washing going on in the washing machines, and the sheets were going back to the Department of Human Services not clean. There was a bigger complication, which was that there was an uncertainty under operating rules that as to who was to pre-clean the sheets before they went into the washing machine. Now, happens to be sheets that come out of institutions where people's continence is not certain, and in many instances, a number of the people who use these aren't continent, so that you'd have defecation and all sorts of problems that were in sheets, and it wasn't clear as to whose responsibility it was to remove that material before the sheets actually got to the laundry. This actually became a union issue because there was a claim that one of the unions didn't have responsibility and that it therefore fell nowhere. So we had two cabinet officers, the state treasurer and myself, sitting around the table trying to resolve who was going to be responsible for removal of fecal matter from sheets and how we were going to reduce the either anger or frustration of the prisoners who were responsible for washing sheets, or we were going to default and go to the Commissioner of Human Services, Ann's suggestion, which was to outsource the washing of sheets to someone who really cared about these issues. So we sorted through that, and Cliff was very reasonable, and we agreed that it would be a mistake to lose the value of this major investment in a large number of large washing machines, and that there would have to be some instruction to the unions in some way of mitigating that or handling the pre-cleaning activity in a way that would be suitable to everyone. And we left the room with a resolution that there would be some closer oversight and better monitoring of how the sheets were actually placed in the washing machines. It took about an hour and a half. Government marched on.
It's a good story. Jim Sheeran?
Jim Sheeran is probably one of a close ally of the governor for a long time, and an admired veteran as well, who had come out of the same area of Essex County in West Orange that the governor had, and whom he knew really well. Both Commissioner Sheeran and Buddy Bianchi had relationships on a personal level with the governor.
Bianchi was banking commissioner?
And he was the banking commissioner. That enabled me to give them instruction or direction or to talk to them or their staffs when necessary, but they had they didn't have that much on a daily or monthly basis to discuss with the governor in terms of actions and activities, and I think their access was fairly personal.
Phil O'Lampy?
Phil ran agriculture. I don't think the governor or most of us spent a lot of time worrying about agriculture, and Phil would champion agriculture at each of the cabinet meetings. He would find some way to raise issues of agriculture and inform the gathered group that there was another event or activity or season in agriculture, and he would also find his way to always praise the governor in each of those statements. So he would have a statement about agriculture and what's going on in agriculture, followed by a statement in praise of what a great job the governor was doing. It was uniform and universal.
How was it regarded?
Everybody enjoyed it and everybody expected it. But it also...
He had served other governors, so he had to sort of show his fealty to this governor every time?
We would assume that he made the same statement to be the preceding and succeeding governors because he served a long time. But one of the things that Governor Byrne did, and this was, I believe, his mandate and not Baumla cases, we met as a cabinet on a regular basis, and part of my responsibility was to develop that agenda. And sometimes the agenda was relatively thin, but it never precluded having a cabinet meeting. I think he really believed in the form of having your commissioners understand that they gather not one-on-one for discussion of their particular issue, but gather as a group to share both concerns and ideas, to bounce ideas off the wall. And Governor Byrne was an astute listener and was slow to speak. It's part of what I think he understood, that his voice carried greater weight than anyone else in the room, and he wanted to hear and elicit thoughts and issues from other people. I know that a number of other administrations, subsequently I don't know about the preceding administrations, that pattern has not been as consistent, and there have even been administrations where the cabinet has met but with the chief of staff or with a senior governor's office personnel, but not with the governor themselves. Brendan Byrne oversaw every cabinet meeting that he was here for, which was almost all of them. We ran a cabinet retreat each of the years that I served as his cabinet secretary, which was 2 days and a constructed agenda in which we all talked about not necessarily any specific issues. We developed policy issues that would be far-reaching or immediate. And in the course of, I guess it was the first year of my service in working for the governor, that we had the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. And there was a cloud that emerged from that, and the question was, where was that cloud going to move, and what were the risks associated with that cloud? Well, no one in Governor Byrne's cabinet had an enormous amount of information or knowledge about subjects of clouds with nuclear risk associated with them, or we knew that weather generally moves from west to east, but how quickly and when and with what degree of dissolution, no one knew. But we met every day as a cabinet to discuss where the cloud was, what we had learned overnight, and what, if any, actions we should contemplate or consider. Joanne Finley, who was Commissioner of Health, would comment at every one of those meetings. Colonel Pagano, who was the Superintendent of State Police, was specifically invited to those meetings to give an update or to respond to issues of what would we do if we needed to evacuate one or another areas, what would be the procedures that would need to be followed. And more than the substance of the dialogue, because eventually the cloud dissipated and no particular action was required of the state, I thought this reflected someone who understood the importance of being ready even if you didn't have an immediate answer, and also in ensuring that everyone placed a stake and took a stake in making certain that the outcome.
That person being the governor.
Yeah, and it was the governor.
I forgot to ask you whether the sheets got cleaned properly after that meeting.
We actually got a better result. We checked up and followed it, and that meeting produced a successful result.
Stanley Van Ness.
Stanley had a great reputation and standing in the administration, and as you know, Brendan Byrne created the Office of the Public Advocate, and it was a really valued position. His role in part because of the nature of the public advocate within the order of the governor's office was not as strong, because he was in a sense a form of citizen watchdog, and he certainly was an outspoken participant in all the cabinet meetings about what policy was, and I think the governor listened to him attentively. I didn't interface with him or act on initiatives within the public advocate's office, and obviously if they were bringing suit or raising complaints about operations of the administration, that would fall into the hands of either counsel or the Attorney General's office.
Do you recall him suing anybody or any department within the Byrne administration?
He sued frequently and with vigor when it was necessary. When I was appointed commissioner, before I was confirmed, as Commissioner of Human Services, I already had a suit on my desk with my name on it, and I don't remember the issue, but conditions in state institutions and in many state programs needed more attention than we were readily able to or willing to fund, and suits were an important part of prompting action, even sometimes unwilling action by this and other administrations.
Joanne Finley?
Joanne was, among other things, Joanne was a very outspoken health commissioner. And I'm trying to remember if we had issues beyond 3 Mile Island that really rose to the surface. I think we we definitely talked about either flu outbreaks if they emerged, things that would happen, and her counsel was looked for consistently. Health had a number of roles. The time that I had the closest involvement with her was we had 6 deaths in an institution as a result of food poisoning over a weekend. And it was Marlborough State Hospital, and they were geriatric patients who had eaten tainted chicken, and they basically dehydrated. And it was a major issue. We called in at I think that there was a uniform consensus to call in the Center for Disease Control from Atlanta to do an analysis of what had actually happened. And Joanne was directly involved in determining the epidemiology and the causes of the actual reason why these individuals had gotten sick and not gotten the care they needed to survive. So she was competent, active, engaged.
To what extent did you have any involvement with federal issues?
I had some involvement with federal issues, but the majority of those were handled by Marilyn Berry Thompson, who ran the Washington office. And she had a good relationship with the governor. She conferred with Bob Mulcahy directly during his tenure there, and with Harold a good deal when Harold took over, because they were 70% related to the federal budget, what would be available and what wouldn't. And she put together an office staff and mastered that budget faster than anyone could, and became sort of the indispensable resource on where do we go and how do we make
Was
this
she a
happen.
Jersey person or a D.C. person?
I knew her as a D.C. person, and I'm not sure whether she came from New Jersey originally, but she was there and remains there today.
Do we have the position of cabinet secretary still?
It succeeded in the Kane administration. Chris Daggett took the position. I'm not sure that it's survived the subsequent administrations. So,
yeah, I don't think there's anybody who walks around with that title anymore.
but there are a number of deputy chiefs of staff as opposed to one. Which in the case of Burns' second term, Harold was the deputy chief of staff, and there was not a deputy chief of staff after Harold assumed the position of chief of staff. So there are within the current structure, I think, deputy chiefs of staff who carry some of this responsibility.
Before you became cabinet secretary, while you were still executive assistant, to what extent did you have contact with Governor Byrne?
I had less contact with him before then. I remember seeing I can have a visual image of my first visit into his small office, which was a really interesting and very modest size office, crammed with memorabilia and cartoons about him and how he was never going to win re-election. But right on the wall, adjacent to his desk, was a reprint of the ballot from 1977 with his name and my name. Now that meant that it was from the Somerset County ballot, and to my chagrin during the entire time I was there, his name is misspelled. It's spelled Brine. And as you may know, when the ballot comes out, everybody in a campaign rushes to make sure that you haven't been somehow corrupted or lost your way. And so I obviously had checked the spelling of Carden very closely, but I hadn't been nearly as vigilant in checking the spelling of Governor Brine. But no one else had either. So,
Who made you cabinet secretary?
the governor, I think. Who
did you succeed?
There was no one there. It was really sort of part of a transition with Bob leaving to take over responsibility of the Sports Authority. Harold was moving up to be chief of staff, and so they were expanding my role to have a better title, have a somewhat larger title in the context of overseeing or assisting in the administration operations.
What did it really mean?
It meant what you make of it. What it meant to us was Harold had 2 or 3 people, it was a much smaller office than it is today, who worked with him on legislative matters. He had responsibility for everything as Bob had. And I was his primary person on administrative matters. And on administrative matters, he was liberal in passing what I wanted to do or suggest or recommend onto the governor through me or by me. He didn't have any hesitation to say, I understand what you're saying, and I'm going to make sure the governor knows. I say, go tell the governor.
How did Hodis differ from Mulcahy as chief?
He's a very different personality and ready to delegate to you the responsibility not only for making sure it happens, but for explaining how it's going to happen. He doesn't have to understand everything. Bob had a demand and sort of a sensibility that he wanted to understand things on a broader level, more comprehensively than Harold would. So he trusted you to be smart and to know what the administration and the governor's interests were and to be observant of them.
What did you work on?
Well, we worked on a variety of issues. I mentioned the creation of New Jersey Transit and the transportation challenges that the state faced, and that was there were big dilemmas in how to both fund and manage the transportation system. I mentioned earlier that the railroad assets had recently become part of the public estate, that they basically transferred from the private sector to the public sector. Transport of New Jersey, which had been a subsidiary of PSE&G, the statewide utility, was the major bus company in the state. And at the time I was at DOT, the state was funding losses of Transport of New Jersey in increasing amounts each year. And in the course of the second term, in the creation of New Jersey Transit acquired all the assets of Transport of New Jersey. So a privately operated but subsidized public bus company became the state's public bus company, the first statewide transportation agency, transit agency in the country. And working through all those issues with both the Commissioner, Lou Gambaccini, and with the governor involved a lot of back and forth. There were similar issues in human services that dealt more with the operations of institutions, the funding of them. Crises in funding were frequent and needed to be resolved. Cliff Goldman would be the primary resolver of those, but there were also issues that came to the governor's office that I dealt with. And where two agencies, say DEP and Transportation, had to come together around an issue, I'd find myself thrown into the middle of that, making certain that A, resolution was reached, and B, the governor's interests were observed.
What were typical discussions at a cabinet meeting like? What were
They could vary widely. Sometimes the governor would just come in with an idea he wanted to throw out, and he would say, so what do you think we're doing right and wrong in Atlantic City? And just listen. Other times there would be administrative issues that needed the attention of all the cabinet officers. We're in the midst of salary renegotiation, so this is where things stand, and we want you to understand that, and they're going to occur once we get through this process. And if there were major budget issues, Cliff would almost always give an update on where the budget stood, but also there were times when he and the governor would have to inform the cabinet that there either were or were not going to be the resources that they were expecting.
Who decided it was time for a cabinet meeting, or was there a regular meeting?
We had a meeting once a month, and I set the agenda in consultation with the governor.
Was it a fixed time, was it the fourth Monday, whatever?
It was changed by the way schedules changed, but it was an effort made to keep it at a regular time.
Were they useful or a waste of time?
Useful.
How so?
The tendency of individuals who have as much to do as senior officials in government do is to want to have the independence and capacity to do what they have to do and be left alone to do it. That's also true of people in the governor's office who would want to ensure that the governor's interests were being observed and that the administration's achieving its objectives in a timely fashion. Coming together removes people from that sole focus and forces them both to listen and to learn something about the larger picture. And it also gives them and the governor a chance to recognize that this is an enterprise that is about more than just about themselves, and that it's not just about what next week's headlines or next week's deadlines represent, but it's about where we're heading and what we're actually doing for this state.
Did Byrne ever ask for a vote on something important?
I think he did. Yes, he would poll the cabinet. He wouldn't necessarily be guided by it, but he would poll the cabinet.
Recall anything in
Trying
particular?
to remember an issue that he would not take that approach on a major issue. He would rather listen to the counsel of those who spoke and keep his own.
Let me ask you a question, a logistical question here. How are we doing on time? And should we try to finish within the next 20 to 30 minutes?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Because we've gotten you now into your role deeply as cabinet secretary, and that's going to soon evolve into a cabinet appointment for you. How did that all come about?
And the governor made a declaration at the end of the third year of his second term that anyone in his cabinet, and there were a number of potential candidates who wanted to run for governor, was welcome to do so, but that there was a requirement that they resign before they announce. And there'd already been some rumors and maybe even a little back and forth between different cabinet members about their interest in running. And Anne announced her intention to run and set a date for resignation early in 1981. And I had dealt with a number of different human service issues, had both a commitment and interest in that department, and went to Harold and said, I'm really interested in this position. And he said, well, then you've got to tell the governor. So I found an opportunity where the governor and I were alone. I think it was at Mormon, and I said, I don't know how to ask this question without putting it in an awkward fashion, but I want you to know that I'm very interested in the position of Human Services Commissioner. If you would consider me, I'd appreciate it.
Was that difficult to do?
It was difficult for me.
You were pretty young.
I was 31. And he acknowledged the question, said, okay, thank you. And that was the end of the conversation.
What'd you think?
I said, well, that's like him. I had spent a lot of time informing people who had seen him seem agreeable to an idea when they were in his office, that the fact that he seemed agreeable did not mean he'd said yes, and it did not mean he said no. They should not take away from it that he had made a decision. And I'm going to diverge for a second because it reflected to me an understanding that Brendan Byrne had about what the office of governor is about the magnitude of it, his respect for it, and also his understanding that when he said yes or no, it was a definitive decision that was going to affect maybe one life, maybe many lives, but the state. And understanding the power and authority of that office and how to both respect it and use it effectively is not something that one acquires naturally. I think he learned a lot by serving in that office, which he had under Governor Minor, and I think he came to it with an appreciation both of the politics of it and of the importance of moving the state in a positive direction. If he were only interested in the politics of it, he would never have even contemplated the office, I think, or if he had, he certainly wouldn't have advanced the income tax and other progressive changes that he thought were important for the state.
Did your personal relationship with him evolve over those years from the initial point of walking into his little office and seeing his name misspelled? Yeah,
they evolved in a very deliberate fashion. I happened to be one of the person in his office who knew how to play squash, which he liked to do in the winter, and who knew how to play tennis well enough that he actually liked to have a partner who was perhaps a little stronger, a little quicker than he was. So in afternoons when he wanted to get some exercise, we actually got to know each other better because I got to play squash with him in the afternoon and tennis with him occasionally. And being on his staff, it wasn't something that you either had to nor could you readily say no to. When he decided at 2 o'clock that it was time for a little exercise, said, let's go play some tennis. I said, well, I'm up for that. And if I had responsibilities, I'd come back and take care of them at a later time.
That sounds like a real privilege to be the chosen one on the court.
And I enjoyed it, and it gave us a chance to both occasionally talk about things that related to the job, but more often than not get to know each other.
Squash is a singles game. You played
Yes.
against each other.
Yes.
Who won?
We split. He was good. I don't remember who won more often, but I didn't always lose, and he didn't always win.
And tennis, you played doubles?
Yeah, and he's a lefty and I'm a righty, so we usually played as partners. Occasionally, we'd switch it up depending on who was on the other side of the net. So back to the commissionership. The lines went dead. I never mentioned it to him again. He never asked me another question. But what I learned was that he went out and performed his own due diligence. He talked to people that he knew and respected who had something to do with that department and asked them about me. And the reports were favorable enough that, and obviously he knew who I was and that he could trust me to be observant of his interests. But he wanted to make sure that it wouldn't backfire on him if he did it, which was smart, and that I was probably up to the job, which it's hard to say anybody at walking into an agency of that size with that many challenges is certainly up to the job, but he thought I was good enough.
Did he call you, summon you to his office, or have Hodis give you the good news? What happened?
He told me, but in a very indirect manner. As I recall, I learned from him that my name was going to be placed in nomination, but I had heard from a number of other people, not from Harold, that he was moving in that direction, that he talked to them and that he didn't see a reason not to do this, and that he had reasons to do it.
When was it?
March. Well, I took office in March. This would happen in early 1981. I'd say January and February. I took office I was sworn in March.
Very short period of time.
It was a short period of time. It was very quick. I had a easy confirmation hearing because we had a Democratic majority, so it wasn't a partisan issue, and the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee were courteous and knew enough about me that they weren't, they didn't have a reason not to want my nomination to go through, and they obviously wanted someone in that position. And less than 6 weeks later, I was back there at the legislature presenting a $2 billion budget that I'd had to sort of get my arms around and explain to them. And 6 weeks later, from that, we had a crisis in welfare funding that brought me back to the legislature for a supplemental appropriation. I think it was $16 million. It may not seem like much today. It was a lot at the time. And we succeeded in getting that appropriation. Governor Byrne presided over my swearing in the governor's office and never gave me any direction or caution to be observant of his interests or to care. Once he made the decision, he said, this is going to be, he essentially said, by his manner, this is your job, now go do it. And no one around him then took me aside to say how it should be done, how his interests should be protected. And all those, I think, are signs of someone who understood that if you're going to manage something as large as a state and as diverse as its needs and wants are, you can't be all in control, and you have to trust people to go out and do the job best they can and to be mindful of how they got there.
You presented a budget. You went before the legislature to solve a funding problem. Anything else stand out as highlights of your brief tenure as a commissioner?
Yeah, we were responsible for managing the department during the first round of Reagan budget cuts. The Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 1981, which brought all of the cuts to social services that David Stockman could achieve. And we had to go out and both manage that in the instances of entitlement programs where there was just literally a reduction in funding, and try to prevent it or offset it in those discretionary areas, which would be the social service block grant area. And the approach that I took was to make a concerted effort to reach out to the community of human service, both constituents and providers, to say, this is not my problem. I have to make decisions that have been fortunate, but it's our problem if you're willing to engage and embrace on how we solve it. So we created county-level steering committees made up for managing the social service process, which was running the risk of getting 10 to 20% reduction in federal funds, which was, again, a lot of money that could not be made up by the state. It wasn't like, if it doesn't come from here, we can find it somewhere else. And included daycare, senior care, senior daycare, services for, other services for at-risk youth, certain foster care, nutrition programs for the elderly or for the disabled, battered women's shelters, all an array of community-based services that were in one way or another at risk. So we created a county-level block grant steering committee that reported to a statewide level block grant steering committee by appointing people or asking people to volunteer to serve on these boards to help us figure out where is this network have the ability to withstand the kind of funding cuts that may come. Simultaneously, I did a personnel audit of the entire administrative structure of the department, and I actually selected people who understood personnel but were outside the human resource department because I wanted an objectivity that I didn't think was going to be available there. And we sent out a questionnaire to every person who did not have direct contact, provide a direct service to a human service client, to describe their job and what and to describe it and what their use was. The net result was we ended up cutting jobs. We eliminated over 300 jobs inside the agency. We eliminated some very senior level jobs that I got sued for eliminating. And
sued by the
by
individuals?
the incumbents, yeah. They thought that it was illegal for me to do it. And we probably cut some money, but the action itself to me was representative. We're not going to try to withstand something as large as this by simply holding ourselves harmless. That in turn engendered a respect from the community level that enabled us to elicit from them recommendations that I never would have expected to hear about how to manage a service cut if it came to it. Because we started by saying, let's look at a set of criteria over what's the most crucial service, something that prevents someone from losing their life. What's the next most important service, something that sustains someone who can't sustain themselves. And so we had a hierarchy of service criteria and said, use this criteria, look at what you have and tell us where you would first or last cut services if you had to do that. Now, if you want to simply protest the fact that this is happening, you're welcome to do that, and I will make the decisions that I have to make. But if you're willing to engage in this process, then we will have a better informed and hopefully a better outcome.
Does the process itself somehow vindicate the budget cuts at the federal level?
It helped a lot, and one of the, to give you a sense of how the politics, the thing that surprised me or sort of represented a substantive victory is that in each county, the service that they claimed should be cut last was that services for battered women's shelters, because they were very underfunded, they were very new, and they were very small. So they were a small constituency in this large pool. For example, daycare was a very big part of the mix because there were a lot of daycare agencies and a lot of kids getting daycare. And a number of other agencies or types of agencies had large constituents. So you could have argued the large will sort of claim their majority and diminish it to someone else. But across the board, people looked at that set of criteria and said, okay, the one thing we can't do is touch these battered women's shelters because they are few and far between, they're understaffed and overutilized.
But were humans harmed by the budget cuts, or were the budget cuts somehow justified once you got to the end of this exercise and realized we can do this?
There were services that were lost. There were clearly benefits that were lost, which we couldn't control because those were basically a federal criteria. You couldn't get food stamps after, if you didn't meet a certain threshold that had been lowered, and the same with welfare, and the same with Medicaid. So that was, people did lose benefits that they needed. In this area where there was a degree of discretion, I think we created an environment for self-help and interactive support that didn't exist before. And an ability to evaluate a service for reasons other than because it's here we need to fund it.
So the cuts had some productive impact.
Adverse environment can create positive outcomes. That's sort of what was my conclusion. That it wasn't all good, but good things came out of it.
Was it difficult becoming a cabinet officer so late in the Byrne term?
I was young enough and ambitious enough and excited enough about it that it never held me back. I probably did choose not to make certain changes that I would have had there been more time, but I certainly made enough changes in the time that I was there that I felt I was using the opportunity successfully. And as I said before, I was given a free hand to do that with the expectation that I'd do it well.
Was the bureaucracy cooperative, or did they see you as a short-termer?
No bureaucracy is fully cooperative, I think, to anyone who is not deeply part of the system. It's part of the bend and flow in government. So some people were more cooperative than others. Some were probably watching their watch or calendar from the day I arrived. And you learn quickly to be insistent when you have to be supportive where you can be, and to be realistic about what you can and can't change in the time frame that you've got, but not to lose ambition over that.
Any other human services issues that you recall having to deal with in that period of time?
I'm trying to think if there's another good singular anecdote. There's a the migration of service, what was happening then and what I think continues to evolve today is the migration of service from isolated institutional care to more inclusive and community care. And it's a major challenge across the board because it involves constituents and bureaucracies, as you were describing, that are resistant to change. And it involves workforces that aren't necessarily ready to make the change, but it's clear that the model that we inherited in the Byrne administration and that exists to some extent today is a model that's based on much older thinking, where people with disabilities or people with mental illness or people who have difficulty conforming to normal behavior have to be isolated from society as opposed to integrated in some fashion. And we're still wrestling with it, but it was a big part of what I dealt with on a day-to-day basis.
So you believe in deinstitutionalization?
I do.
As the administration came to a close, what did you consider as your career options?
I didn't plan particularly closely what I was going to do next, and I worked through the first, I delivered a very comprehensive transition report to the incoming Kane administration, and because they had a little difficulty finding someone to serve in the Office of Human Service Commissioner, it turned out to be George Albanese, but it took till April or May before they actually found an appointment that they were ready to make. So I was a holdover for 3 or 4 months, and I did some consulting work after that in a couple of human service areas, and by the end of the year I went to work for Walter Mondale in his presidential race.
And I know you've had a very active political life since then. You've run for Congress at least once.
Yeah. I run for office every 25 years. I ran in 1977 for the legislature, 2002 for Congress. So in 2027, maybe we can have an interview.
Maybe you'll pick a Democratic district to run in.
That would help. That would help. I tend to pick the uphill battles.
How do you regard Brendan Byrne today?
I feel really fortunate to have worked with and for him. I think that he is representative. He is a person who both understood the office and appreciated the importance of it from the day he got there. That he didn't have to learn. There are other skills that he developed along the way. But it stood him in good stead during a very turbulent and difficult first term, and it enabled him to have major accomplishments in the second term. So I admire his gubernatorial record and and in the subsequent years of seeing him periodically, his appreciation both for the humor and the excitement that government can bring.
At what point during this period of time did you become a married man and a family man?
Oh, I married the woman who took my job at DOT in 1977. I left to run for the legislature, and in that same Alan Sagner-run Department of Transportation, Amy Rosen, whom I'm still married to, literally took my job. So
what had she been doing prior?
She had. She likes to say that she worked for Paul Jordan when he ran for governor against Brendan Byrne, and she likes in '77. And as she likes to describe it, she said that the Paul Jordan campaign was bought by the. She was sold to the Brendan Byrne campaign because when he dropped out, he endorsed Brendan Byrne, and in a sense, so all the people who had been working for him said, "Now you're all Byrne supporters." But she didn't know much about Brendan Byrne at the time, and so she had been working in that campaign and had graduated college a couple of years early and had been working in a law firm before that, and not as a lawyer. And so she knew Tim Hull and knew Alan Sagner and decided to look for a job, and coincidence brought her to the Department of Transportation. So when I was running for office, she and I would talk about what I had done when I was in that position, because she kept hearing from people in the department that whatever she was doing was not the way that Tim Carden did it, which is exactly how a bureaucracy reacts to every newcomer. They always claim that whoever was there before making their life miserable did a much better job than the newcomer does. So we had a good chuckle over that, and she actually helped me set up that meeting on high-level lighting that we got Don Linke to oversee. And we got to know each other then, and when I was in the governor's office, where those issues of transportation, and in particular the condition of the transit systems, the railroads in particular, were in dismal shape, and we were wrestling to try and come up with the answers to that. There was a commuter group called Shore Commuters for On-Time Service, or SCOTS, which had a very petulant leader whose name I don't remember. I think it's Nesbitt, but I'm not sure. And he had a habit of calling the Department of Transportation, the commissioner's office, at 7 o'clock or 6:30 or 7:30 in the evening, and he would always open with, "Well, you might wonder where I am," and he would not get the commissioner; he'd get Amy, and he'd say, "Well, I'm standing on the platform here in Newark Penn Station waiting for the 504, and it's 7:32." So you can imagine how I feel. So they would discuss why, and she would give him the reasons why it so happened that the 504 seems to have been stuck in New York or never made it out of Asbury Park or wherever, and he would rail and then get off the phone. Two times out of three, he would then call the governor's office, dissatisfied with the answer he'd gotten from the Department of Transportation to report this egregious service, and he'd get me. So one of the ways that Amy and I got to know each other is that we would get to share stories as to how angry the commuter advocates were on a particular night.
He should know what happened. When did you marry?
1981, right before I became commissioner. I was nominated in February. I was married March 7th. I took a one-week honeymoon. We took a one-week honeymoon, and I was sworn in on like the 11th or 14th. No, probably the 16th or 17th of March.
And her father was running for the U.S. Senate that year.
That's right. That's right. He ran that year.
Unsuccessfully for the Democratic nomination.
For the Democratic nomination that Frank Lautenberg secured and held for 3 terms.
How many children did you eventually have with
We have 3 children, ages 23, 20, and 17. So.
Do they ever say to their mother, "That's not the way Daddy does it"?
Every child learns that trick. Every child learns that trick.
You're still politically active. What do you see as New Jersey's major problems?
I think New Jersey's problems are not unique to New Jersey. I think New Jersey tends to front-run what is affecting both other parts of the country and the country at large, and that is we have not engaged in a political support building for the services that we all expect. So everything is underfunded, and we are increasingly underserved relative to our expectations. I think there are bigger and broader issues on the horizon that we are coming to grips with, but our ability to do, and that would be dealing with the concept of an energy-constrained environment again, of issues of environment and quality of life that are closing in on us quickly and that are not unique and that New Jersey can't solve alone. But again, our political dialogue leaves very little room for broad acknowledgement of the size, magnitude of the problems, and therefore the magnitude of the solutions that has to be. I think we're still wrestling with education both in our cities and in our poorer areas, but also across the board in determining that we have a system that, while we're educating children better than we have, we still haven't gotten as far as we should, particularly considering the amount of money we're investing in that system, that it's a system that in which we are making robust investment and not getting a sufficient return.
Can this state afford more taxes?
Yeah, I think the state can afford more taxes, but I don't know that there is political will to devise and manage that. And I think that equally important is to simultaneously dedicate yourself to efficiency, which government constantly lags the private sector on achieving, and to redistributing in a manner that's fair, which is a simple way of saying that the property tax, to the extent that it's dependent on across the board, makes it very difficult to create a uniform and balanced system for whatever it's funding.
If you were talking to somebody very young, your children, eventually your children's children, what would you say Brendan Byrne did for the state of New Jersey?
He raised the level of integrity and substantive ambition for the government, I think, during his 2 terms in office. He introduced he succeeded in enacting an income tax which 2 previous governors had failed to do. So it was a watershed moment, and I think that it is an important element to a modern revenue structure for this state or anywhere else. And he was selective in the initiatives that he chose to pursue, and that selectivity reflected both an ambition to be successful in those and a recognition that you can't do everything within a given time frame, and that to spread yourself too thin is to risk not achieving what may be the most significant contribution. And I think of the Pinelands as one of those that he came to during his term in office. He didn't start with an ambition to preserving the Pinelands, but by taking that on as he did in his 2nd term, he succeeded in perhaps making as great a contribution as any governor could to the future well-being of the state.
Was he as good a governor as you've seen in your time in this state?
I haven't seen any other governors as close up as I've seen Brendan Byrne, and I have a personal loyalty, so I have a prejudice to that extent. I said it before. I think his strength was how he understood the office and how to perform the assignment of governor with both an ambition to be successful and a respect for what that office is as something larger than himself.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us.
It's great to be here.